On this cross-section, UCLA English professor Mark McGurl discusses his critically acclaimed book, The Program Era, Post-War Fiction and the Rise of Creative Writing. McGurl is the 2011 winner of the Truman Capote Award for Literary Criticism.
Hello and welcome to a cross-section special. My name is Chris Gondak, and today I'm going to be speaking with Mark McGurl about his book, The Program Era, Post-War Fiction and the Rise of Creative Writing. Mark McGurl is a professor of English at UCLA and the author of The Novel Art. He recently won the Truman Capote Award for Literary Criticism from the University of Iowa. Mark McGurl, welcome to Cross Section.
Glad to be here.
So where were you when you heard you won the award?
I was actually in my office on campus writing an exam for one of my classes. So it was a real juxtaposition of the daily labor of teaching with this wonderful news from afar.
Did an exclamation of Yahoo ring out through the campus at Westwood?
I don't remember what whether I vocalized or not.
Yeah.
I probably did. I probably gave some sort of yelp, yeah, because we don't win a lot of awards as literary scholars, especially certainly not awards like this. So it was incredibly good news.
So now this book is both literary criticism and literary history to a degree. Mm-hmm. Why did you want to write it?
Well, creative writing programs is a huge phenomenon. Depending on how you count, there are 350 creative writing programs in the United States now, whereas in 1936, when Iowa was founded, there was one. So we've gone from one to hundreds over the course of 50 or 60 years, and yet very few scholars had paid attention to this phenomenon as mattering to American literary history. Most of the writing on creative writing that existed, most of it anyway, took the form of, it was sort of literary journalistic, and the question is, are creative writing programs good or bad? And usually in literary journalism, the answer is bad because they are standardizing writers. They're doing that's having all sorts of pernicious effects to institutionalize creativity in this way. And while I don't dismiss those arguments out of hand, it struck me that creative writing is a huge enough phenomenon that we have to step back at this point and get a little bit more of a subtle and to me more interesting view of what it is, where it came from, and how it's mattered to American literature.
Now there are 3 creative writing programs within the University of California system, and probably the best known one's the one at Irvine, at UC Irvine. What can you tell us about that program?
Irvine is a very, very impressive program. It was run until recently by a wonderful writer, Jeffrey Wolfe. And it has lots of illustrious graduates, Michael Chabon, Alice Siebold, Richard Ford, Helena Maria Viramontes. So they have an illustrious cast of characters who've come out of that program. And it's just always been a very, very well-run creative writing program. There's also programs at Riverside, which is run by Tom Lutz, this wonderful nonfiction writer. Lots of interesting people out there. And at Riverside, they actually have a BA in creative writing, unusually. And it's also done in San Diego, has a really interesting creative writing program with lots of interesting figures down there.
So that's the UC system. Are there people particularly within the Los Angeles area who might not be affiliated with the UC system who are kind of products of this program? The creative writing programs? Well,
I mean, the biggest story, although he's not a product of a creative writing program, the biggest story in creative writing in Southern California the last year or two is that Jonathan Lethem, author of Motherless Brooklyn and many other novels, he has, he pulled up roots from Brooklyn, where he's from, and moved and took the Roy Disney chair of creative writing at Pomona College. That was the chair that had been held by David Foster Wallace.
Right.
And so that was big news. I mean, Lethem, he got started as a writer when he was sort of living up in Berkeley, kind of on the margins of that campus, and then moved back home to New York, and now he's here, and that's big news.
So now this is a book about creative writing programs, and it won a Literary Criticism Award. We talked a little bit earlier that you are a professor of literary history and literary criticism, but you don't teach creative writing.
I don't.
Was this an issue for you as far as people accepting the book?
Well, yes, in the sense that any time a literary scholar says that he or she is going to write anything on creative writing, the assumption is that it's going to be a hit job. There's a long history of tension between literary scholars and creative writers who have inhabited the same space, offices, but whose attitude toward literature is very, very different. Literary scholars and critics are highly analytical. or purely analytical in their relation to literature, whereas the creative writers, they're actually practicing, they're doing it, and it's a different perspective. Since literary scholars have ruled the roost for so long, it's looked to us, I guess I should say, like something like an insurrection from within, these creative writers coming out of nowhere and beginning to take over the place. And by the same token, creative writers, have gotten very, very used to literary scholars seeing them as maybe a little bit anti-intellectual, not quite belonging on a college campus. So there's this really interesting history, and I had to be aware of that when I was writing this book. That that the last thing I wanted to do with this book was simply engage in the pro or con aspect of, are creative writing programs good? Are they bad? That seemed to me an interesting question, and I don't think there's any reason to stop debating it. On the other hand, for the purposes of this book, I wanted to step back, not worry about whether creative writing programs are good or bad, and begin to sort of analyze them and begin to tell their story.
Can we talk about the first author you mentioned in your book, the author Vladimir Nabokov?
Mm-hmm.
He came here to the United States from Russia. I think he might have come from France, but he is of Russian birth.
Mm-hmm.
He taught at Cornell. Why did you start your book with Nabokov?
Well, I'd always known about Nabokov at Cornell, and so that was just in my basic knowledge of literary history. I had in mind this idea that this hugely important writer had this very important interesting relation to a university. And so I thought it'd be worth investigating. And then the more I investigated, the more interesting it seemed, even though it turns out that Nabokov did not teach creative writing at Cornell. He was a lecturer on literature. But it seemed to me an interesting way to sort of start the story. This is in the 1940s into the 1950s. So Nabokov at American colleges, he started at Wellesley. This seemed to me an interesting way to sort of start the story with a writer of unquestioned importance, one who had this interesting relation to a university, but who did not, who was not, as it were, part of this creative writing system at all. And yet, even as he was at Cornell was starting its own creative writing program. He just happened to not be involved in it.
So had Cornell approached him with what you look like, with what you've looked at as far as his life, do you think Nabokov would have been okay trying to teach creative writing, or would he have just dismissed it as completely out of hand?
It's hard for me. I mean, you never know. You never know because, you never know. But it's certainly hard to imagine Vladimir Nabokov adopting that role. I think he was much more comfortable in the role of authoritative lecturer, standing at the lectern, sort of pronouncing on literature than he would have been with the kind of intimacy with the imagination of your students. That is sort of step one for a creative writing teacher. It's hard to imagine, but you never know. You never know.
From an education point of view, the book really kind of starts at the beginning of the 20th century, and the big change, at least as far as I got of the book, happened in the 1920s. Let's talk about a duo from the 1920s that everybody who's been in a college English class or even a high school English class knows about,
right.
Ernest Hemingway and William Faulkner. You talk about these two as kind of a duo, although they knew each other, they certainly didn't write together, and they had very different styles. What's the tension that you're trying to get to when one looks at Hemingway and one looks at Faulkner, and how does it play through the rest of your book?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say that's interesting about those two writers is that neither of them was in any way importantly affiliated with a university. I mean, Faulkner had trouble getting a year done of undergraduate at Ole Miss. Hemingway, as far as I know, I don't know if he ever stepped on a college campus in his existence. So you're talking about two major writers who had nothing. So by contrast, they show what has happened to the field of American literature when these two big names really had nothing to do with higher education. Now, the reason I'm interested in them is I'm interested precisely in the contrast of their styles. Hemingway is famous for writing in a highly disciplined, terse way, whereas Faulkner is, wild rhetorically. And so it struck me that there was something there of almost a principle to grasp onto. On the one hand, a writer whose principle seems to be less is more, who wants to let as much as possible be there by implication, the famous iceberg theory of literature that lots of high school kids learn, versus Faulkner, who's the genius of the high style, very loquacious narrators, and there's something there. There's something perfectly complementary to Hemingway. And it seems to me that both of those principles, the principle of self-limitation and discipline on the one hand with Hemingway, and a kind of rhetorical, expressive quality on the other, if you take those two and put them together, you get one of the ways that creative writing instruction works. It's interested both in teaching students to express themselves, but also to discipline that self-expression.
So before we move creative writing into the academy, one of the things you talk about is back when Hemingway started, it was really a question of journalism was seen as a way to get into writing. Do you think the fact that Hemingway was a journalist kind of led to his rather terse style, that he had to when he started out writing, he had to learn how to put things together fairly quickly, as opposed to Faulkner, who I don't think he started as. No. He was just a writer who was very prolix and off he went.
Yep. That's no doubt true. That's the story that's often told about Hemingway. That it's noticed that when he was a journalist, oftentimes he would send in his stories by telegraph. So people have looked at that and said, well, that must have something to do with his style, with his more or less direct style. I think that's probably true. I mean, it's worth pointing out that journalism is still important in its relation to literature. I mean, the point in this book is not to sort of deny the other important features in the environment of literature, so much as to notice that creative writing programs are the new thing. And so Faulkner, he was not a journalist, and really did not have the same sort of disciplinary upbringing in terms of as formation as a writer.
So if we say in your book that Hemingway and Faulkner are casting rather long shadows over American literature in the 20th century, we can bring it back to the next author you really focus on, Thomas Wolfe. What is it that's important about Thomas Wolfe for your book?
Well, again, I mean, I started with the biographical fact that here was a writer who spent a good long time at university, NYU in his case, and he was teaching composition at NYU in the 1920s, and that was having already been in for the first kind of proto-creative graduate creative writing program, which had been at Harvard. It was in playwriting, and he was a member of that. And so I put that together. He was at a writing program at Harvard. He was a teacher at NYU, and then I started to think about Thomas Wolfe. Thomas Wolfe, he is, if you're looking at American literary history, especially 20th century American literary history, he really is the great self-expresser. And so, if you want to isolate that feature of creative writing as a discipline, he's a good figure to look at because he really takes you directly to this question of, will the student learn rules? Will they memorize things, or will they let something emanate from within? And he is the ultimate version of that, certainly to a fault, at least for me as a reader. I find him tough to read, just because it's really just lots of sort of late romantic effusions about himself and about his place in the world. And it can get kind of tiring. Nonetheless, what he represents, self-expression, even if it usually takes a much more disciplined form, that principle of self-expression is key to creative writing, and part of why you want to have creative writing classes to begin with, because they are something like an antidote to sort of more traditional modes of education, where you memorize, the last thing you do in most of your classes is make things up. So being able to make things up seems to be a very, very, very progressive, gesture for education.
Is this the term autopoetics that you use in your book? A sense of that idea of self-expression has been really almost an ongoing subject in American literature, maybe starting with Wolfe and moving all the way into today.
Oh yeah, and he's even before Wolfe. I mean, you could look at Walt Whitman. No, it's true. I mean, I use the term autopoetics. There's lots of technical vocabulary in this book. There are terms that I sort of invented to try to draw attention to things and see them in a new way. And autopoetics was a term that I used just to describe the ordinary self-reflexivity of literature, which is most clearly evident in a writer like Thomas Wolfe, who's constantly writing about himself. I mean, so that his novels, they're barely fictional. I mean, the protagonist doesn't have the name Thomas Wolfe, but everything that the character does, Thomas Wolfe did. And so there's that expression in that sense. But of course, that sort of self-reflexivity goes even deeper than just writing what you know, writing about the experiences you've had, converting them into fiction.
So that whole idea of self-expression, is this one of the reasons why creative writing programs had to be developed anyway? Because if you think about disciplines within the academy, as you've already alluded to, self-expression generally, it's particularly back at the turn of the 20th century, wasn't highly valued. And as they began to say, okay, we need to bring this into the academy, but we can't necessarily put it into our traditional English department or any traditional department that we have, is that why all of a sudden now you have this thing, a creative writing program, which allows students to express themselves?
Yeah, I think that sounds about right. Essentially, and this is especially true later in the century, come the 1960s, educational institutions become very self-conscious about, they don't want to be prisons. They don't want to be the bad version of an institution, right? They don't want to merely limit their inmates. And so how do you allow students to sort of explore themselves? You become hospitable to the creativity of the student. And it's interesting because the value of creativity isn't just limited to literature classes. Creativity as a value has become, especially since World War II, has become sort of pervasive certainly in American institutions, even in the sciences, where they talk about scientific creativity, where the whole idea is to think something new, not merely to memorize the old. And creative writing takes place in that context.
Let's talk about the institution that awarded you the Truman Capote Award, the University of Iowa. They were really the first and still probably the best known writing program in America. It must have been a little bit like eating the first oyster for them, that we're now going to go forward and try something completely different. And for people that would think about this, you think most of literary production in 1930s America was being done in New York and the Eastern Seaboard, some work here in California, which begs the question, why did this start in Iowa?
It's a very good question, and lots of people have tried to answer it in various ways. You can point to various things. For instance, Iowa in the 1930s was a relatively, was an ambitious institution looking for ways to distinguish itself. It was hospitable to innovation. So in that context, this sort of newfangled thing, creative writing, seemed more plausible than it might have at other places. But probably, and then also people have pointed at there was a long tradition, sort of a Midwestern tradition, local even tradition in Iowa City of writers' clubs. So this idea of people getting together to talk about their writing was there. But it seems to me the most, probably the biggest reason that we look to Iowa now as the creative writing program was the guy he didn't found it, but he really made it what it is today. This guy Paul Engel, who ran the Writers' Workshop for decades, the crucial initial decades, and was a tireless promoter of it. Knew a good thing when he saw it, and really kind of brought Iowa into the limelight as the writing program.
One of the things you talked about earlier is this issue of, as one institutionalizes creativity to the degree that you can, that an argument is that you begin to, I don't want to say commoditize aesthetics or commoditize writing, but there ends up perhaps being certain kind of house styles. Is it fair to say that Iowa has, or at least in the early stage, does Iowa have a house style?
I think that would be a tough claim to prove. I mean, you have to fall back on very generally, yes, you could say that Iowa, as a broad generalization, has been associated with a certain kind of realism. So it's not certainly been famous as a place for experimental writing, for instance. And you can make those generalizations about various writing programs. That said, though, in the 1960s, one of their teachers for a few years was Kurt Vonnegut, hardly an ordinary realist writer, right? So So I always pause when I hear people making too broad generalizations about the house styles of various places. The faculty of creative writing programs tend to be very, very small. And people shuffle in and shuffle out, and depending on who's there, you'll have a different sort of emphasis in the air.
World War II. Let's move it. Let's move it off stage rather with just a movement of the hand. Now it's post-war America. One of the things that was big in post-war America, particularly in collegiate education, was all of a sudden where university education was somewhat limited to the people who could get into it. With the GI Bill and everything, now you have a large group, the baby boomers actually, going into universities and colleges. How did that affect writing programs?
Well, it was a growth environment for higher education, right? So to put some numbers on it, before World War II, maybe 10% of the population had some higher education, and then by the 1970s, you're getting over 50%. So you're getting millions and millions of new students in colleges of various kinds. And so, institutions are bursting at the seams. They are just, madly trying to grow large enough to accommodate the students that want to attend them. In this context of general growth, when everything's growing, when you're founding this, founding that, founding the other thing, founding a creative writing program is sort of becomes kind of a more plausible thing to do, because people are looking for things to build. It's profoundly, sadly different from the situation we're in now with higher education, where people are looking for things to sort of downsize. This was they were looking to upsize, and that was a rising tide that brought creative writing with it.
When you think of the UC system, like how many parts, just let alone campuses, let alone programs, were developed after World War II. You can definitely see where that expansion is coming. But as all these students come in, some of them apparently, even if you just take the same percentage overall who want to study creative writing, just the numbers are swelling. How did the change, was there a change in how people taught creative writing? You kind of got a sense that short stories became a lot more popular, at least as far as writing programs, because there was a ready market for good short stories in the teaching of new creative writers.
Yeah, well, yes. I think short fiction had always been important to creative writing instruction. Why? Because it's sort of intuitive. It's a whole. So a student can hand in a whole thing rather than, say, part of a novel. Which might be worth doing, but is a different kind of thing.
Did the nature of literature in America change to reach out towards those individuals who might not have gone to college in the 20s and 30s, but make work more accessible to them that was literature, not necessarily genre work? Can we start seeing changes in post-war American literature kind of focusing that group of individuals?
I think so. That's one of the claims of the book, is that one of the, broad movements in post-war American literature, it comes from and is associated with writers like Raymond Carver. Raymond Carver is sort of in some ways he's there are a lot of candidates for this, but in some ways he's the ultimate writing program product and figure. His career as a writer was owed, entirely to the expanding higher education system. So he goes to, Chico State, and then and where he meets John Gardner just by chance, meets this famous writer, and he kind of wants to be a writer too. And then if you look at his career, it's so sad. He died at like 50 years old. He died very, very young, did Carver, but not before really becoming. He's kind of the post-war Hemingway, in that he's the sort of minimalist, stripped down writer whose career can't be understood unless you understand how higher education found him. He was from a family with no college in their background. The higher education system found him and then educated him. So he takes creative writing classes. He ends up at Stanford as a fellow at Stanford, taking classes there, and then employed him. He, went from one creative writing teaching gig to another. I think this is true. I think that he actually at one point had two jobs teaching creative writing. He just didn't tell the institutions that he had two jobs. And they were just trying to get from one to the other, and they were in different states. So we're trying to get from one to the other without them knowing. Now, I actually didn't end up confirming that, so I'll just let that go as a story. But it gets to the point that Raymond Carver, is, he's exemplary in that sense. And lo and behold, the substance of his stories, these sort of very downbeat, rigorously ordinary people, dealing with their rigorously ordinary problems seems to me a reflection of, yes, here are lots of formerly unliterary people coming into the higher education system, and this is the literature that's produced.
So if Carver is perhaps our post-war Hemingway, is Oates our post-war Faulkner?
Hey, that's great. Yes. Yes. Good.
What
Yeah.
is it?
Well,
What is it about her that makes our post-war
well,
Faulkner?
because when you think of Joyce Carol Oates, you think of a writer working, producing the maximum. It's not just that she famously writes lots of books, which that's the big cliche about Joyce Carol Oates, but she is an incredible creative dynamo, and it's easy to although because she writes every kind of everything. She's written minimalist stories, which are really good, but also has written, Faulknerian works of kind of Faulknerian scope and energy. So she would be a good candidate.
Several times in this interview, as we wrap this up, you've been saying that you didn't want this book to take a pro or con position about writing programs. However, one of the things you can't get away from this book is realizing that one of the things that writing programs has done, in some ways you could say one of the things it was built to do, is produce a lot of literature. So what have American letters gained from this kind of explosion of literature after World War II that was helped and enhanced by the creative writing programs?
Well, American letters, it's gained a lot of good writing, Basically, one of the ideas that I sort of float, and it's strange to me that it would be a weird idea, but that if you take lots and lots of people and you put them in the classroom and getting them to think about how to write good fiction or good poetry, that you would, lo and behold, you'd have lots of good literature emerging from that. That seems like a strange idea to lots of people, but now that said, finding lots of talented people and pointing them toward becoming good writers doesn't mean that we have enough readers for them. And so there's an inherent pathos in the situation where we have partly thanks to creative writing programs, we have a large number of competent or better writers, but we don't necessarily have the readers for them.
Has American literature lost anything, though, by this burgeoning explosion? I mean, has the tide gone down overall, even though the strict number of books has gone up?
I don't think so. I mean, there are lots of people who would want to argue that. I don't think so. I think that if American literature has lost anything, really what it's lost maybe are some of its pretensions to wildness, because most writers at this point have offices and they hold office hours. And they do those kind of conventional things that professionals of various kinds do, so that said, there are plenty of writers to this day who aren't on campus, who aren't interested in going to creative writing programs, and are as wild as you could want. So, that said, to the degree that creative writing programs and the professionalization of the career of novelist or poet has continued apace, the risk there for writers is that they'll wake up and feel like they've been institutionalized in a bad way. That means that they've been conventionalized, that they've been given a buffer against the really interesting experiences in the world. That's been a constant concern. I think it's an overblown concern, personally, but certainly if you want to be the wild man poet, getting a degree to do so is a funny thing to want to do.
You have to apply to be a genius.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, here's my application. Yes. Yeah.
Mark McGurl, thanks for being on Cross Section today.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks for joining us for this episode of Cross Section.